vote, the yeas are 401, the nays are 0. Two-thirds of those present having voted in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed without objection. A motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Fussell.
Reservation. Mr. Speaker,
Gentlemen, we'll suspend just a minute. Let's see if we can get a little better order. Members will please take their seats. We have business to transact. Members, please clear the aisles. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Fussell.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, I present a report on H.Res. 395, directing the President to provide certain documents to the House of Representatives concerning the use of the $27 million appropriated for humanitarian assistance for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance, a privileged resolution of inquiry.
Clerk will report the title.
Report to accompany House Resolution 395, directing the President to provide certain documents to the House of Representatives concerning the use of the $27 million appropriated for humanitarian assistance for the Nicaraguan Democratic Resistance.
Refer the House calendar and ordered printed.
Mr.
Gentleman
Speaker,
from Florida.
I ask unanimous consent for the immediate consideration of in the House of H.Res. 395.
Is there objection to the request of the gentleman from Florida?
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Michigan reserves the right to object.
I do, and I do it for the purpose of allowing the chairman to explain the...
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman will yield,
I am happy to yield.
the gentleman will remember that on May 1st, 1986, the Committee on Foreign Affairs ordered H.Res. 395 reported unfavorably. This action was taken after the committee received numerous classified documents relating to the items requested in the resolution. After review of these documents, the Committee on Foreign Affairs and the chief sponsor of the resolution, Mr. Panetta, concurred that the executive branch was in essential compliance with the resolution, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, at the appropriate time, I would move that the resolution be tabled. And I thank the gentleman from Michigan for yielding.
The gentleman yields. Objection request the gentleman from Florida,
Mr. Speaker,
Mr.
further reserving the right to object,
Gentleman
and I yield to the
further
gentleman
reserves
from
the right to
California.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. As the sponsor of the motion of inquiry, I do not object to the action of the Foreign Affairs Committee at this point with regards to the tabling that will take place on the motion. We have been provided all of the documents by the administration that it has with regards to the $27 million in humanitarian aid. It should be made clear, however, that a gap still exists as to how a majority of those funds were in fact used. We required at the time of providing that aid that the President and the administration would develop an accounting procedure to be able to track and ensure that those funds were used for humanitarian purposes. Unfortunately, the funds that went into Central America are difficult to track specifically as to their usage, and this is something that is concurred in both by the State Department as well as others. I have had the opportunity to look at the State Department documents. I have had the opportunity to get intelligence briefings on this issue. The fact still remains that a good portion of those funds cannot be adequately tracked as to their usage, and I have urged the committee to proceed with its investigation with regards to that usage. I yield back my time.
Mr. Speaker.
Is there objection to the request of the gentleman
Mr. Speaker,
from Florida?
I support the motion by the gentleman from Florida, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and withdraw my objections.
Mr.
Is
Speaker,
there objection to the request of the gentleman from Florida? Chair hears none. Does the gentleman have a motion?
I move that the resolution be tabled.
Without objection, the motion to table is agreed to, and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to Section 36B of the Arms Export Control Act, Public Law 94-329, as amended by Public Laws 97-113, 99-247, I move that the House resolve itself into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of the joint resolution H.J. Res. 589, And pending that motion, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that general debate on the joint resolution be limited to not to exceed 2 hours, to be equally divided and controlled by the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Broomfield, and myself.
Is there objection? Chair hears none. The question's on the motion. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. Accordingly, the House resolves itself into the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of the joint resolution H.J. Res. 589, and the chair appoints the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Trexler, to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union for the consideration of the joint resolution H.J. Res. 589, which the clerk will report by title.
Joint resolution prohibiting the proposed sales of certain missiles to Saudi Arabia.
Without objection, the first reading of the joint resolution will be dispensed with. Under the unanimous consent agreement, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Fassell, will be recognized for 1 hour, and the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Broomfield, will be recognized for 1 hour. The chair recognizes the distinguished gentleman from Florida and the chairman of the committee, Mr. Fassell.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of H.J. Res. 589, and at the outset, I want to commend the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Levine, for his leadership in this effort, in this resolution of disapproval. The fact that there are 222 co-sponsors, and perhaps more by this time, of this measure is a tribute to his hard work and dedication. It is important to understand that in considering this measure, Mr. Chairman, the Foreign Affairs Committee based its position on a number of valid foreign policy considerations. First and foremost, the committee does not believe that this proposed sale would advance U.S. national security interests in a volatile area of the Middle East. I've always personally had problems with the introduction of more advanced weapons to the Arab states at a time when a state of war actually exists in that region, and I can't see how it would lead to a resolution of that problem. It was the committee's judgment, for example, that Saudi Arabia has failed to support U.S. peace efforts in the region, and beyond that, it has continued to withhold support from Egypt because of that country's peace treaty with Israel. And rather than support U.S. anti-terrorist objectives, Saudi Arabia provides $85 million annually to the PLO. In short, Mr. Chairman, from a foreign policy standpoint, the committee concluded that this proposed sale was not justified, that it was unwise, unnecessary, and contrary to stated policy objectives of the United States. And therefore, I support this resolution and urge my colleagues to do the same. And I would like to yield at this, how much time? I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the principal sponsor of the resolution, Mr. Chairman. And I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, the principal sponsor. And I wonder if we could have order, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's point is well taken. Conversation will suspend. The gentleman, Mr. Levine from California, is recognized for 5 minutes on the resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the chairman of the committee for yielding and thank the chairman of the committee for his leadership on this issue. Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of House Joint Resolution 589, and I want to begin by thanking both the chairman of the full committee and the chairman of the subcommittee for the expeditious manner in which the House Committee on Foreign Affairs has been able to consider this resolution. This resolution, Mr. Chairman, not only has the support of over 230 co-sponsors, but a number of other members who frankly reflect a bipartisan group of this House from across the entire political spectrum of this Congress. These members share a deep concern about American arms sale policy in the Middle East and a fundamental concern about United States national interests both here and abroad. Simply stated, Mr. Chairman, the opponents of this sale do so because of the consistent antipathy Saudi Arabia has shown for fundamental American national security interests in the Middle East. We do not believe that this sale would further American interests in the region. The United States has several vital national security interests in the Middle East in addition to ensuring access to oil. These interests include broadening the Camp David peace process, combating terrorism while denying terrorists any base of support, and helping our allies Egypt and Israel to maintain their military and economic security. Saudi Arabia has not only failed to support the United States in every one of these three crucial areas, but has actively opposed us in all of them. For example, Mr. Chairman, the Saudis to this day continue to isolate Egypt for Egypt's willingness to pursue peace with Israel. To this day, Saudi Arabia has refused to reestablish formal diplomatic relations with Egypt. Saudi Arabia has bankrolled the PLO and has bankrolled Syria, the protectors of terrorists implicated in the murder of hundreds of Americans, including the bombing of the Marine barracks in Beirut. According to the State Department, Mr. Chairman, the Saudis gave some $90 million last year to the PLO. Other reliable estimates run as high as $250 million. According to testimony presented by the DoD in 1985, the Saudis gave up to $500 million to the Syrians last year. Under Saudi leadership, pan-Arab organizations have stepped up efforts to punish American businesses that have the temerity to do business with Israel, imposing increasing requirements for U.S. aid to Israel because of boycott efforts to strangle Israel economically. And the Saudis have sided as recently as this month with Muammar Gaddafi in our recent showdowns with the Libyan dictator. The arguments the administration makes to defend its proposal to sell these missiles are, one, that the sale would be a reaffirmation of U.S. support for and friendship with Saudi Arabia, two, the missiles are needed to defend against an attack by Iran, and three, the Saudis need the missiles to maintain their defense capabilities. Mr. Chairman, none of these arguments is particularly compelling. First, nearly every transaction between Saudi Arabia and the United States has been touted as a so-called test of friendship. But what have we received in return? At what point can the United States expect that in return for our consistent responsiveness to Saudi security interests, that they respond to ours? Second, these missiles, which are not scheduled for initial delivery until 1989, will not help Saudi Arabia counter the Iranian threat. The Iranian Air Force now has less than 100 planes. To counter this, the Saudis already have more than 300 air-to-air missiles. If a war-ravaged Iran does indeed pose a threat to Saudi Arabia, it is a ground threat. This arms package is of no use against an Iranian ground threat. Finally, the most serious threat to the Saudis is an internal threat from extremist elements. The sale of these missiles will do nothing to respond to that threat. For nearly 2 decades, Mr. Chairman, the United States has been almost reflexively granting Saudi arms requests. But our policy has neither yielded Saudi support for key U.S. initiatives nor resulted in Saudi cooperation in advancing U.S. security interests in the Middle East. In fact, selling arms seems to be our only policy with respect to Saudi Arabia. We have sold them some $44 billion worth of arms in the past 14 years, regardless of Saudi Arabia's consistent insensitivity to United States national interests in the region. There are no compelling reasons to continue this policy. If the Saudis want our cooperation, then let them give us theirs. This pending missile sale, which meets no legitimate Saudi need, is an appropriate place to halt our unproductive policy. Mr. Chairman, can I ask for 2 additional minutes?
I yield the gentleman 2 additional minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
For 2
Chairman.
additional minutes.
I would like to say one word about my special concern about the inclusion of Stinger missiles in this package. The Stinger is a sophisticated, effective, and portable weapon. It has been called the ideal terrorist weapon. It has been called the terrorist delight, and it is. While I oppose the sale of the administration's missile package to Saudi Arabia, I especially object to the inclusion of the Stingers. Terrorism, as we all know, is on the increase. desperate terrorists will stop at nothing to obtain every possible means to help carry out their brutal and barbaric undertakings. We should keep these weapons under United States lock and key and not send them to a part of the world where terrorism is the game of the day. Simply stated, Mr. Chairman, it would be insane to send the Saudis Stingers at this time. For all these reasons, Mr. Chairman, I oppose the sale of these missiles to Saudi Arabia. I am very pleased that such a strong, bipartisan cross-section of this House has joined in opposing this sale and supporting this resolution. I urge my colleagues to join me in disapproving this proposal and hoping to send a message to the Middle East that will start injecting a policy in the region that will be consistent with American security interests and American national interests in that region of the world. Again, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your leadership. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. Distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Broomfield.
Mr. Chairman, I yield at this time 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Solomon, a member of the committee.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman, and ladies and gentlemen, even though I am one of the strongest supporters of the State of Israel and their sovereignty, I do rise in opposition to this resolution today, and I strongly support the administration's proposal to sell the arms to Saudi Arabia. There are many valid arguments in favor of selling these weapon systems to the Saudis, not the least of which is the fact that each of the systems in this package is something the Saudis already have, and we should be looking at this as a practical matter. And so the argument that somehow this package represents a new and a dangerous threat to the security of Israel is, in my judgment, an argument that is unconvincing to the point of being almost ludicrous. No, the real threat to Israel and to Saudi Arabia comes from Iran. It's ironic that the American Congress should even consider disapproving this sale to the Saudis when the strategic momentum in the Iran-Iraq war has shifted decisively in favor of Iran, and what does that do to the State of Israel? The security of the entire Persian Gulf region is at stake, ladies and gentlemen, and American interests in this vital part of the world are not served by undercutting those moderate Arab states that have long looked to American leadership and support as indispensable elements in maintaining security in the Gulf. And that is what the issue is at stake in this debate, as it finally boils down to: American credibility. If we cannot assist our friends in their efforts to assume a greater role in the protection of the Persian Gulf, we shall soon be without friends, ladies and gentlemen, and the responsibility for security in the Gulf will fall exclusively on our shoulders. Do you want that? Mr. Chairman, the geopolitical realities of the Persian Gulf have changed dramatically in the 7 years since the Shah of Iran fell from power. For the many decades, the Saudis and other friendly countries surrounding the Gulf relied on Western powers for protection, first the British and then the Americans. Throughout the 1960s and the 70s, we assured the Saudis and others that Iran was a reliable American partner in guaranteeing safety and security for all of our friends in the Gulf region. But all that changed in 1979. The collapse of American interest and influence in Iran, as well as the subsequent war between Iran and Iraq, have served to destabilize the entire Persian Gulf area. Recognizing the new realities imposed by these developments, the Reagan administration has embarked on a very careful course of providing appropriate American assistance to those countries in the region that are willing to assume an increased role in providing for their own defense, as well as to contain the Iranian menace. Such was the motivation behind the administration's decision to sell AWACS to Saudi Arabia in 1981, for which the Saudis have already paid $6 billion in anticipation of actual deliveries of that aircraft. What will we do when we have to come back and certify that? They are relying on an America that keeps its word. Think about that, ladies and gentlemen. They are also relying on an America that can help them maintain and modernize those weapons already in their inventory. And that is exactly what the proposed arms sale seeks to do. Mr. Chairman, I do not normally read quotations into the record from the editorial page of the Washington Post. But in this instance, I feel compelled to conclude my remarks by reading from an editorial that appeared in the April 28th edition of the Post, and the editorial says, and listen please,
The missiles in question are all of kinds that Saudis have bought before, integrated into their military forces, and kept from irresponsible hands. The requirement for the United States to make good on routine resupply at a moment when Iran is pressing aggressively against the modern Gulf states should be evident to anyone concerned with the stability of this region. The editorial, ladies and gentlemen, concludes, the most efficient way to turn a difficult situation into a disastrous one is for the United States to show it cannot distinguish between radical Arab states that practice terror and moderate Arab states that seek shelter. The former must be isolated, the latter must be encouraged, they say. That compels Washington to show its understanding in palpable ways of the legitimate security needs of friendly Arab states. Ladies and gentlemen, this morning I met with the Israeli Defense Minister, Mr. Rabin, as did some of you in this chamber. And I posed the question point blank to him, would these sales hurt the security of Israel? And do you know what he said to me, ladies and gentlemen? He said, Mr. Solomon, you members of Congress must look at the overall situation, the broader picture, because there is more at stake in just that question. And he shrugged his shoulders and he said, you will have to vote your best understanding. Now, I asked for 2 additional minutes.
I yield the gentleman 2 additional minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 additional minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had a member come up to me just before I took the floor. And he said, Jerry, he said, why are we considering this resolution when Israel itself is not even opposed to the sale? Well, you know, that's a good question. President Reagan is just returning today from having been extremely successful in dealing with the #1 priority of this decade before us, and that is terrorism. He has convinced our NATO allies that they must join with us in fighting state-sponsored terrorism. President Reagan on television last night before the world said that Syria is one of the major exporters of terrorism. Syria is the #1 threat, according to the defense minister of Israel. Syria is the #1 threat to Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to join with the president in fighting terrorism. We need moderate Arab states to join with us if we are going to lick this #1 problem that's facing the world today. So I would ask you, even though I know the political smart vote would probably be just to vote this disapproval and let it go, I think that we, as American congressmen, have the responsibility to look at the broader picture, as the defense minister of Israel said this morning, and let's approve this sale like we should. Thank you. I'd be more than glad to yield to someone I deeply respect from the other side of the aisle.
I thank the gentleman, and I share the respect for the gentleman. I felt that one point you made deserved to be put in context. I sat with you in the meeting that you referred to this morning with the defense minister of the State of Israel, and it's a sensitive point because the conversations in that discussion, I believe, were confidential conversations and not for publication, if I understood the ground rules correctly. But I certainly got a different reading of that meeting and of the implication from him than you did, and I would ask the gentleman if it is not correct that the broader context of that discussion certainly didn't leave any implication of support for the sale.
If the gentleman would get me a minute, I would respond.
May I ask either side for an additional minute for the gentleman from New York? Mr. Chairman, could I ask 1 additional minute for the gentleman from New York?
Have I got some time?
30 seconds.
Yield the gentleman 1 additional minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
1 additional minute without objection.
Yes, I was not my understanding that that meeting was off the record. As a matter of fact, anything that was off the record was said to be off the record. But when the question was posed, does Israel support the sale? And of course, his statement was that Israel never supports the sale to any country where there is a state of war. But that's when he shrugged his shoulders, if you recall, and said to us, you have to, and that's when he went into the broader picture, which I thought was a very good explanation on his part.
But the gentleman is not asserting that the Israelis have wavered in their opposition to this arms sale in any fashion. Is that correct?
No, it is my understanding that the Israeli government, as well as AIPAC, as a matter of fact, have not given us any opposition in writing. As a matter of fact, they're not opposed to it.
Just for the record, and I don't believe this is the essential or central part of the debate, that is not an entirely accurate statement. I have a telegram from the Prime Minister of Israel indicating his opposition, which I'd be very happy to put in the record, and I believe the government of Israel's very consistent position on this has been that they oppose this arms sale.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Florida, Mr. Fasel.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Indiana, chairman of the subcommittee.
Distinguished gentleman, Mr. Hamilton is recognized for 5 minutes.
Ask unanimous consent to revise and extend.
So ordered without objection. The chair hears none.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to H.J. Res. 589 and in support of the sale. I want to thank the distinguished chairman of the committee who has, in this case, as in all others, been very fair and just in his handling of these matters. This sale must be seen, it seems to me, in the context of recent events which has severely eroded the U.S. position in the Arab world. For the first time in decades, our policy of maintaining close ties to the pro-Western Arab states is in real jeopardy. Stalled peace efforts, our refusal to support arms sales to Jordan, terrorist actions and subsequent reprisals, many of which we can justify, have nonetheless had a cumulative and serious negative impact on U.S. interests with important Arab countries. A denial of this sale calls into question U.S. influence and credibility in the Middle East, and our interests are best served by strong, open, and credible relations with moderate Arabs, and this sale is, whether we like it or not, in the eyes of the Saudis and much of the Arab world, a test of that relationship. I support this sale for several reasons. First, for 35 years, the United States has had a special military relationship with Saudi Arabia, and it's in our national interest to preserve that relationship. The security tie is based on the importance and vulnerability of Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, and the threats to the security, to their security and their oil assets. These assets are essential to the economic prosperity of the West. They must remain available. They must not become subject to Iranian or Soviet threats. Saudi Arabia is a pro-Western, anti-communist country. This sale can help assure that Saudi Arabia can protect its security, contain threats from the Iran-Iraq war, and Iranian extremism. Second, this sale provides missiles necessary to the defense of Saudi Arabia. As arms sales go, it's a very small package. It helps the Saudis only modestly, and it hurts Israel not at all. There's no major enhancement of Saudi military capabilities here. These are all standard follow-on items. Without this sale, Saudi missile stocks would be deficient by 50% in 1991 because of missile attrition for a variety of reasons. Next, this sale does not threaten the security of Israel. There really is no credible evidence from military experts that holds that this sale endangers Israel. The judgment of most defense analysts, American or Israeli, government or non-government, is that this missile sale will not affect adversely the military balance of power in the Middle East. Israel enjoys today a growing military qualitative edge in the region, according to our U.S. defense experts. Next, this sale will enable the United States to continue to maintain the role as an honest broker in the Middle East. If the sale is denied, the unique standing that the United States has in the Middle East will be in jeopardy. To deny the sale will undercut the peace process and play into hands of those radicals who seek to foment anti-Americanism and portray the United States as anti-Arab and as a co-belligerent in the regional conflicts. We're all disappointed that Saudi Arabia is often not supportive of U.S. policies as supportive as we would like them to be. Without doubt, we have major differences with them. But there are many areas where our interests coincide with the Saudis. They want to protect the shipping and oil installations of the Gulf, and so do we. They want to block Iranian and Soviet expansion, and so do we. They want to resolve the conflict in Lebanon, and so do we. They want to shift the Arab consensus away from confrontation with Israel toward negotiation, and so do we. They want to end the Iran-Iraq war, and so do we. They support King Hussein's efforts for peace, and so do we. It is in Israel's interest as well as our own to maintain our credibility and reliability with this pro-Western, strongly anti-communist state like Saudi Arabia. Next, this sale should be approved because of the new and the increased threats to Saudi Arabia. Iran has established a beachhead in Iraq only a few miles from the Kuwaiti border. Iran is the formidable threat to the Gulf states. It must not be allowed to establish domination over the Gulf. At the other corner of the peninsula, South Yemen has recently experienced a coup, and the situation is unstable, and it's exacerbated by Soviet interference. That raises the potential of another threat to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis need right now...
Additional minutes.
I thank very much the Chairman.
Chairman's
The
recognized
Saudis
for 2
need
additional
now
minutes.
a relevant showing of America's constancy. They are a major anti-communist power in the Gulf, and to strengthen their defenses with equipment which is interoperable with our own is to our strategic advantage. And finally, the predictable result of blocking this sale will be to have the Saudis turn to another supplier, a supplier that is glad to have the business and that makes no effort to impose the policy restraints that accompany American arms. The United States defense relationship with Saudi Arabia represents both influence and leverage. We cannot let it slip away without hurting ourselves, without hurting our friends, and without hurting our allies in the region. Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to view this sale in the overall political and strategic context of the region. I urge them to affirm that the United States can be friends with Israel and friendly Arab states alike, and to conclude that this sale is in the national interest of the United States. I hope my colleagues will support this sale and will vote against H.J. Res. 589, and I thank the Chairman very much for his courtesy in extending additional time to me. Yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Chair was advised, the managers, that Mr. Fassel has 43 minutes remaining, and Mr. Broomfield has 53 minutes remaining. Mr. Broomfield.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 4 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Gilman, who is the ranking minority member on the Europe and Middle East Subcommittee. 4 minutes.
The distinguished gentleman is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I ask consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Order without objection. Chair hears none.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of this resolution, H-Con Res. 589, of which I'm an initial co-sponsor. Although I believe we should have an arms supply and a political relationship with moderate Arab states, I don't believe that the administration has made a convincing case for this sale at this time. I don't believe that there has been enough support for the Middle East peace process by the Saudis in the past few months. In justification of this proposed arms sale, there have been allusions to the help that the Saudis have given us, but I fail to perceive that kind of assistance. On the other hand, we did hear the invocation of reflexive anti-American rhetoric after our recent raid on Libya. A moderate, well-armed Saudi Arabia might not be active enough. The administration cannot assure us that the Saudis would come to the aid of Jordan if Jordan and Syria went to war. While the Saudis are likely to participate in the Gulf Cooperation Council's Rapid Response Force, the threat faced by the Gulf states are land strikes. Iran's Air Force is enfeebled. I want to commend the efforts of the gentleman from California, Mr. Levine, in bringing this resolution before us today. He's devoted a great deal of time and attention to this issue. Although the distinguished chairman of our Foreign Affairs, Middle East, and Europe Subcommittee, the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hamilton, opposes the resolution, I want to note that he's been eminently fair in his treatment and consideration of the issue. The committee has been fully aware of his views, which are in the minority, but if you were not aware of his views, you'd not be able to determine them from the prompt and thorough manner that our subcommittee has been able to consider this issue. Mr. Chairman, I believe that this is the wrong time to consider this kind of a sale to Saudi Arabia. The administration has not yielded to our pleas that it not engage in a confrontation on this matter. Accordingly, I believe we should reject the sale, and I invite and urge my colleagues to support the resolution of disapproval and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back 1 minute. Gentleman from Michigan seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Kemp.
Distinguished gentleman from New York, Mr. Kemp, is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection,
Thank
the
the
chair hears
chairman
none.
and my colleague from Michigan, and of course our colleagues on the Democratic side of the aisle. This is a extremely important issue. It's one debate that has been carried out on the floor of the House today with a degree of equanimity which is lacking in other debates of this type. I hope it can continue. Honest and well-meaning friends and supporters of a relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia can be obviously on opposite sides of this resolution. I happen to favor the resolution, co-sponsored it, and agree with my colleague, Mr. Gilman of New York, and Mr. Levine and others on the Democratic side, that the time is a poor one in which to engage in another sale of arms to Saudi Arabia. Let me say very carefully, because I think what is said in the floor of the House of Representatives and in the Senate is extremely important to the ability of this country to build more relationships and friendships throughout the world. I favor that. I rise in favor of a very strong strategic cooperation between the United States and Israel, the United States and Egypt, the United States and Saudi Arabia, and the United States and Jordan and other states in the Middle East who want to cooperate with the United States in trying to bring a more peaceful environment to the problems of the Middle East. Let me be very frank. We have a strategic relationship with Egypt and Israel, and we need to build one with the Saudis. I hope it can be done. But the idea that we have to continually prove our friendship by selling more arms to the Saudis is, I think, a fallacious one. It's a faulty premise, if you will, and it leads to some faulty conclusions. To wit, the United States has already sold more military goods and services to Saudi Arabia than to any other country in the world. No other country even comes close. Sales to Saudi Arabia exceed $50 billion, including about $20 billion remaining to be delivered. No other country has purchases amounting to more than $12 billion. Indeed, the total sales, listen to this, the total sales to all our European allies amount to something less than the total amount of sales to Saudi Arabia alone. This trend has continued in recent years, and just last year, the total sales to the Saudis amounted to $3.5 billion, or more than 25% of the sales to all countries. Now, with all due respect to my colleagues who are in favor of the sale, that's an honest position with which I happen to disagree. And as I said earlier, I appreciate the environment in which the debate goes forward. But we have yet to build this type of strategic cooperation with the Saudis that we have built with the Egyptians. Egypt supports peace process between the United States and Israel, and of course there's a triad there between the Camp David nations. Our friends, the Saudis, need to be friendly. They need to be more friendly with Egypt. They need to be more friendly with Israel. They need to make peace with Israel, and I am convinced that the strategic cooperation with Saudi Arabia would be enhanced, not deterred, by them coming into the peace process and making their peace with the State of Israel. Number two, Saudi Arabia is very critical of the Camp David Accords. I don't see how anybody can be critical at this critical moment in the history of the Middle East of Egypt willing to make peace with Israel. It seems to me we need more of it. Finally, the Saudis, I can't understand why, do not allow the United States ships to make port at the Saudi in Saudi Arabia. Egypt does, but not Saudi Arabia. I would hope, if they're listening to this debate, that they might be encouraged to be more cooperative, because as Mr. Hamilton pointed out, if they want to keep the Gulf open, if they do rely on the United States for keeping the Mediterranean and the Gulf open, it seems to me they ought to at least allow U.S. ships to land at Saudi ports. I would have hoped that the strike force, the U.S. tactical strike force, would be allowed to land at Saudi airfields. Not so. I can't understand. Give me another minute to wrap this up.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman an additional
Gentleman is
minute.
recognized for additional.
I hope that I hope that the Saudis will allow U.S. airplanes to land at Saudi air bases. I wish that they'd begin to speak out forcefully against Gaddafi in Libya and the terrorists in the Middle East. Look, I want to make it clear, I am for strategic cooperation with Saudi Arabia. But I don't like the idea that every litmus test has to be passed only by the United States. They're getting huge amounts of arms sales. I hope that Saudi Arabia becomes strategically cooperative with the United States and with Egypt and with Israel. We need more of their moderation. They need to support Camp David. And frankly, I think the Congress on both sides of the aisle would be very cooperative with Saudi Arabia in any test of friendship if there were some quid pro quo with regard to some of these key issues that we face in these very difficult days in the Middle East. I made the point that all of the sales to the Saudi Arabian country have not changed the mix. They've got more than 3,000 Sidewinders right now. That means they've got, for every one Iranian airplane, over 150 Sidewinder missiles. It seems to me that this sale does nothing to enhance their security. I please vote for the resolution, and you're not going to do anything to hurt our relationships among moderate Arab states.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Levine.
I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Studs.
Distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Studs, is recognized for 5 minutes. So ordered without objection. Chair hears none.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this resolution. I do so as one who strongly supports the U.S. commitment to a secure Israel and who advocates strict limits on the sale of U.S. weapons overseas. I have been a member of Congress for almost 14 years. During that period, there have been only 4 or 5 proposed arms sales of sufficient importance and controversy to reach the level of floor action in either the Senate or the House. In each prior instance, the proposed sale involved the introduction of new and highly sophisticated technology into a region, or a sale to a country that had no prior experience with the kind of weapon involved. Never, under any administration or with respect to any country, has a sale of the relatively modest scope we are considering today been formally voted on by either body of Congress. In considering how to vote on the resolution, I would urge members to ask themselves the following questions. Has the government of Israel described this sale as a serious threat to its security? Will this arms sale upset the military balance in the Middle East? Are the weapons involved essentially defensive in nature? Do there exist real threats to the military security of Saudi Arabia? Is it in our national interest to help the Saudis defend against potential threats, particularly to their oil fields? Have the Saudis misused or misallocated U.S. military aid in the past? Is Saudi Arabia an aggressive military power? Is Saudi Arabia an important player in diplomatic and economic negotiations of consequence to the United States? Can the U.S. simply take for granted the continued friendship and diplomatic support of moderate Arab states? Can we, in the long run, win the battle against terrorism or lay the groundwork for peace in the Middle East without a fair claim on the friendship and trust of moderate Arab states? Will the rejection of this arms sale improve the behavior of Saudi leaders from our perspective? Will it strengthen our position and influence in the Arab world? Mr. Chairman, I think we all recognize that there are limitations on the friendship between the United States and Saudi Arabia. The Saudis do not always act as we would like. We do not always act as the Saudis would like. We are very different countries. We come from different traditions. We have far different attitudes toward Israel, and we do not always understand each other very well. But it is hard to deny the importance of the Middle East to the United States, and it is hard to deny the relevance of attitudes in Saudi Arabia to the Middle East. The arms sale we are considering today should not represent a critical milestone in our relationship with Saudi Arabia. The government of Israel does not see the sale as a significant threat to its security. The weaponry involved represents no advance in technology from what has already been sold to the region. I have little enthusiasm for arms sales in general, but to reject this modest sale would be to imply that the United States has no interest whatsoever in the security of Saudi Arabia, and that is an attitude that I simply do not understand. Abandoning moderate Arab states because they happen to act like moderate Arab states, rather than as we would wish them in all circumstances to act, does not reflect to me a mature understanding of foreign policy. And it seems to me naive to think that rejection of this arms sale will somehow strike a blow against terrorism, or that it will in the long run contribute to the security of Israel. There is one other point I would make that pertains more generally to U.S. policy toward the Middle East, and that explains in part why this arms sales proposal is in such trouble. Given the level of attention and excitement generated in the White House by other foreign policy issues, I have been surprised by the relatively casual attitude that the administration has adopted thus far with respect to this resolution. It is true that administration representatives of moderate rank have called the approval of this arms sale vital to our national security, but it is obviously not sufficiently vital to warrant the personal attention of the President or the Vice President, neither of whom, to my knowledge, have volunteered a word about the subject. We have not heard this issue discussed by the President on one of his Saturday noon broadcasts. It has not been the focus of a prime-time address. It has not even been accorded the status of an op-ed piece from the White House Director of Communications. I make this observation because of a larger issue that concerns me a great deal. I know it is fashionable to compare this administration's foreign policy favorably with that of its predecessor, but I think the least one can say is that during the Carter years, we used to hear administration officials from the President on down speak occasionally about what they were for, instead of simply what they were against. And we saw a willingness to devote time and energy to the difficult tasks of constructive diplomacy, whether or not immediate headlines or political benefits were involved.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman additional minute.
I thank the
Gentleman is
gentleman for his
recognized for an
kindness,
additional
particularly
minute.
given the position I'm articulating. The whole world knows by now that the Reagan administration is against Gaddafi, but I doubt, frankly, that 10 members of this House could provide a coherent explanation of what the positive goals of the administration are in the Middle East and what the strategy is for seeing that these goals are achieved. This administration is against terrorism. Fine. It is also against communism and arms control. But negativism is not much of a policy. Today, the House will vote clearly to reject this arms sale. As one who will be in the minority on this issue, I would like to argue that the resolution before us will damage administration policy. But it is difficult to damage something whose nature and whose very existence is one of the best kept secrets, if not the only kept secret in Washington. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank the distinguished gentleman from Michigan for his kindness, and I yield back any time that may remain.
is that confronts us. My speaking in the well surely isn't going to change any votes or even any attitudes. It's an exercise in sheer self-indulgence, but I have always believed we're accountable not only for our words but our silences, and it's difficult to stand by and see David Stockman's assessment of the courage of Congress grappling with the tough issues, grasping the nettle, validated without at least making some small protest, however unavailing. The decision we have to make today, and it's a foregone conclusion, is shall our policy in the Middle East be one of hunkering down behind the sandbags on the Golan Heights, or shall we play the role of honest broker or seek the role of honest broker, maintaining some leverage, some credibility, some influence?
Gentleman's time has expired. The distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Broomfield.
Mr. Chairman, at this time I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, a member of the committee.
Distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, is recognized for 5 minutes. So order without objection. The chair hears none.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my colleagues. I want to commend the gentleman who just spoke, Mr. Studs. I think he had a very excellent, brilliant analysis of exactly what this situation is that confronts us. My speaking in the well surely isn't going to change any votes or even any attitudes. It's an exercise in sheer self-indulgence. But I have always believed we're accountable not only for our words but our silences, and it's difficult to stand by and see David Stockman's assessment of the courage of Congress grappling with the tough issues, grasping the nettle, validated without at least making some small protest, however unavailing. The decision we have to make today, and it's a foregone conclusion, is shall our policy in the Middle East be one of hunkering down behind the sandbags on the Golan Heights, or shall we play the role of honest broker or seek the role of honest broker, maintaining some leverage, some credibility, some influence with the moderate Arab states? There are some basic facts that have to be considered. These weapons don't upset the balance of power against Israel, and nobody says they do. The Persian Gulf is vital, and it is dangerous. There's a war going on between Iran and Iraq. The Afghanistan people are suffering a bloody invasion by the Soviet Union. South Yemen is in chaos, communist chaos. Libya is spreading its poison all throughout the area in the world. Syria is increasingly becoming an armed camp with Soviet weapons. There are radical extremists everywhere. And at this moment in time, what do? Turn our back on a moderate Arab state that is a friend of this country's. These radical extremists hate us, they hate Israel, and they hate anyone who deals with us. The General Accounting Office has said the security for these weapons is very high, so let's not make any mistake on that. A defensible, strong Saudi Arabia has many advantages. It bolsters moderate Arabs everywhere. Do we need moderate Arabs? I would say we do. It will deter Iran, Libya, Syria, and the rest, and it lessens the possibility of ever using American troops in the area. Remember, President Carter said that the Persian Gulf was one of the most important places where our national interests were at stake. The Saudis have helped the search for peace in Lebanon. They have helped and are helping the freedom fighters in Afghanistan. They have helped and supported Pakistan, which is a country bearing the burden of 3 million refugees from Afghanistan. They have supported the moderate forces in Sudan. We are fully committed to the survival and the security of Israel, but our friendships in the Arab world contribute to Israel's security. The Saudis have supported Jordan, which, defying radical Arabs, has restored relations with Egypt, has helped rehabilitate Egypt within the Arab world. Is that useful? Is that a contribution to peace? I should think so. My friends, as terrorism becomes an instrument of national policy among the radical states of the world, ought we not extend a hand of friendship to those moderate Arab states and moderate states in the world which resist terrorism? Do we isolate ourselves from all Arab states and confirm Gaddafi's anti-American ravings? The Saudis will get their arms. So much for our influence and our leverage in the Middle East. We can't give the Arab world another reason to hate us. Think of Lebanon and the murderous crossfire there. Think of Syria and our hostages. Think of Iran and its visceral hatred of Americans. Think of Libya and its irrational and pervasive terrorism. You can't compare Saudi Arabia with these cauldrons of hatred. Is it in Israel's interest that we maintain our credibility and our friendships with these moderate Arab states? If we're ever to achieve peace, a lasting peace in the Middle East, the Saudis and the Jordanians will have an essential role to play. And given that reality, let's not engage in counterproductive actions that jeopardize critically strategic relationships. Ladies and gentlemen, friends are awfully hard to come by in that part of the world. Passage of this resolution is no way to treat a friend, and it's no contribution to peace. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Levine.
I yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wolpe.
Distinguished gentleman
Mr. Chairman,
from Michigan is recognized for 3 minutes. Without objection, the gentleman will be...
Mr. Chairman, as an original co-sponsor of legislation to disapprove the pending weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, I rise in strong support of H.J. Res. 589. The administration's initiative is simply the wrong proposal at the wrong time, and in my judgment is offered for the wrong reasons. It should be unequivocally rejected by the Congress. Since 1971, we have armed the Saudis with more than $44 billion of our most advanced weapons, with this administration selling $22 billion worth of military equipment since 1981, including the promised delivery of AWACS aircraft. Each successive transaction has been accompanied by assurances from the President that such arms sales would further the national security interests of the United States, specifically through understandings that Saudi Arabia would help support our political and diplomatic interests in the region. I wish that the President's faith in Saudi Arabia's sharing of common goals with the United States and the pursuit of constructive policies were in fact justified. The plain fact is that Saudi Arabia has done nothing in the past 5 years to contribute to peace with Israel or to assist our other endeavors in the region. To the contrary, we have sought from Saudi Arabia its cooperation on two fundamental matters: the peace process and terrorism. And on each count, Saudi Arabia has failed decisively. The Saudi leaders have consistently opposed every major American diplomatic initiative in the Middle East, particularly Camp David and Israel's agreement with Lebanon. Saudi Arabia has helped orchestrate the campaign to isolate and punish Egypt for its peace treaty with Israel. The Saudis have done nothing to encourage the efforts undertaken by King Hussein to enter into a dialogue with Israel. With respect to terrorism, Saudi Arabia continues to finance the PLO and other radical elements who perpetrate the worst crimes against innocent victims in Israel, other countries in the Middle East, and Europe. Saudi Arabia extends economic and technical assistance to Libya and has pledged to help Colonel Gaddafi absorb any losses from the United States' economic boycott of Libya. The central issue posed by this proposal, once again, is what is to be the nature of our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Is the United States to be primarily an arms trafficker using weapons to appease political pressures, or are arms sales to be an integral component of a larger policy that meets the national security and political interests of both countries? Why should we continue to support militarily a regime which exploits every opportunity to undercut our relationship with both Israel and more moderate Arab states in the region, such as Egypt and Jordan? Is it really so much to ask Saudi Arabia, 4 decades after Israel's birth, to simply recognize its existence and try to establish a non-hostile relationship with that country? Must we continue to arm a country that views our strongest ally in the Middle East, Israel, as a criminal pariah enterprise? The burden is on the administration to justify this sale and to respond to these questions. They have not done so. This proposal is harmful to our national security. It is unjustified.
Gentleman's time has expired. Distinguished gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Weber.
Distinguished gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Weber, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we are again being asked to make policy based on the myth that we can somehow buy friendship from alleged moderate Arab states in the Middle East. We are being told that we have two friends in the Middle East, the state of Israel and, of course, the Saudis, and that in this case we have to help one friend as we have helped the other. Let's look a little bit at the facts before we decide that we should equate the two friendships. First of all, the record shows fairly clearly that we cannot get much help in terms of pursuing peace negotiations in the Middle East from the Saudis. In 1981, the President sought to win approval of the AWACS aircraft sale to Saudi Arabia. He assured the Senate that the Saudis would reciprocate by providing, quote, substantial assistance toward, quote, the peaceful resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict. That isn't what has happened. Instead, the Saudi Arabians have remained intimately connected with Syria, a militant rejectionist state that advocates terrorism. It has remained steadfast in its opposition to the Camp David Accords, and it has insisted that Russia co-chair Middle East peace talks. and has called for recognition of, quote, legitimate Soviet interests in the Middle East, close quote. Those are the Saudis' words. Furthermore, it has continually refused to recognize Israel's right to peacefully coexist with its neighbors. Furthermore, the notion that they are a friend to ours, equal to the Israelis, is just a myth as well. In the fight against terrorism, they have affirmed, quote, total solidarity with Gaddafi, and in the recent confrontation responded to the U.S. strike on Libyan terrorism infrastructure by saying that they were, quote, firmly at Libya's side in the face of the savage aggression perpetrated by the U.S. administration. Now, that rhetoric, in my judgment, goes far beyond what would be necessary for mere Arab solidarity. I yield to my colleague from
I want to
Pennsylvania.
associate myself with his remarks and ask the unanimous consent to revise some of my remarks at this point in the record.
I thank the
So ordered
gentleman
without
from
objection.
Pennsylvania. My time is short. All I would say is the notion that we have two friends in the Middle East that we should try to be helping in some kind of an even-handed way has not borne out to be true in the past. It will not in the future. We should pass the resolution and prevent this sale from taking place.
Distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Levine.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Seiberling.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Seiberling, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Revise and extend
So
my
ordered without
remarks.
objection.
I thank the distinguished chairman. This is a real dilemma for those of us who feel that it's very important for the United States to remain in the position to mediate some of the serious issues in the Middle East, and at the same time to avoid playing into the hands of the extremists. Now, nobody who believes in our type of government would say that the Saudi Arabian government is the ideal form of organization of society. But they are confronted with the possibility that Iran, for example, could try to move onto the Arabian Peninsula. Perhaps if the Iraq-Iran war were settled, Iraq might. And there are all kinds of fanatical extremists in the Middle East who would like to overturn the Saudi government. So I don't think we can just dismiss it out of hand, as the previous speaker did, wanting to maintain good relations with a country that's so strategically important and is, after all, a moderate government as some go. On the other hand, it seems it's inconceivable to me that we would want to turn over to any government in that area the so-called Stinger missiles, which are just made to order for terrorists who can attack airplanes at any airport in the world. We shouldn't be giving them to Savimbi or to the Contras either, or to any other country outside of NATO or allies that we know we can rely on. That's the feature of this that makes me rise to strongly oppose this proposed sale and to support the resolution of disapproval. If that were taken out, then I would revise my position and be willing to go along with the sale of arms to Saudi Arabia so they can protect themselves against the more fanatical states in the Middle East. And I hope that message is sent by the action of the House today, and certainly this member would govern himself accordingly. Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan. Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Dornan, a member of our committee.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, and the two distinguished leaders of our parties in foreign affairs, would that all debates conducted in this distinguished chamber take place with such a distinguished level of debate on both sides of the aisle. This is a very tough subject to approach because we do want to keep the Saudis as a friend. But every now and then, every 5 to 10 years, there comes along a vote that I think members should do well to contemplate that particular vote has the unique ability to come back and bite them years and years in the future, even when they find themselves in that distinguished status as a former member. If sometime in the next decade, or even further into the future, a Stinger missile traceable back to any Middle Eastern country knocks down some jumbo jet somewhere in the world and 300 to 400 innocent people die, it'll be a sad day for some members in this chamber, still here or retired, if they have to realize that their vote on this issue was traceable back to that particular Stinger mission.
Would my friend yield?
Gladly
I take
yield.
it that you oppose Stingers to Savimbi then?
I was just about to comment on that.
Good.
Because of the research that I've done on this missile that is made in a California district of our good colleague Jerry Lewis, this particular debate has caused me to rethink how we allocate and how we control Stinger missiles that I've heretofore suggested in this well should go to the courageous leader of the freedom forces in Angola and to the courageous forces fighting for freedom in Nicaragua, the Contra tyrants, the Contra communists, the freedom fighters there. Also, the people being genocided by Soviet weaponry in Afghanistan. How are we going to get this small but powerful weapon for freedom so easily turned into a weapon for terror? Now, I want our country's friendship to continue. As Mr. Solomon and others have said,
Give the gentleman an additional minute.
it is important that the House of Saud remain friendly to the United States, but I associate myself with the remarks of Mr. Vin Weber, of Mr. Levine of California, and others that question whether or not this friendship is a two-way street or whether it's just a one-way street. $44 billion of arms over the last few years is enough to have Saudi Arabia not only not leaking money into terrorist groups around the world, but not making the outrageous statements they've made about past incidents of terror around the world. In 1913, when a band of very bold and courageous Arab tribesmen on the edge of the empty quarter took over a small fort and began the House of Saud, they have come a long way to the distinguished Harvard graduate Sheikh Yamani exercising incredible power over our economy with the petrodollars that are exchanged around the world. I would like to see a little more decency extended toward Western Europe and the United States on energy questions and an absolute clean bill of health on not helping terrorism before we approve any more sales like this.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bonnier.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, no member of this body and no citizen of this nation can doubt the vital importance of the Middle East or the fragile nature of its politics. Since World War II, our nation's policy in the region has been guided by twin goals, goals that are mutually reinforcing. First and foremost, we have dedicated ourselves to an unwavering commitment to the security of Israel, our closest ally in the region. At the same time, we have tried to maintain close relationships with the more moderate Arab states as a bridge to peace and as the key to guaranteeing the economic security of the Western world. Today, these goals are threatened as never before. Radicalism is on the rise throughout the Middle East, from the militant fundamentalism of the Ayatollah in Iran to the terrorist regime of Gaddafi. Extremists prevail. Now more than ever, it is important that we strengthen our ties with the more moderate nations of the Arab world. The resolution we are considering today to prohibit the arms to Saudi Arabia will not advance U.S. goals in the region. It will only serve to erode our influence. It will undercut our relationships with this pro-Western, anti-Soviet nation. And it will give greater fuel to the radicals who seek to humiliate the United States and drive us from the region. This proposed arms package will not disrupt the balance of power between Israel and its neighbors. The vast majority of defense specialists both here and in Israel have confirmed that it presents no security threat to Israel. Instead, it will bolster Saudi Arabia against possible attack from Iran or the Soviet-backed regime in South Yemen. It will provide the nation with a greater ability to protect international access to the oil reserves of the Persian Gulf. I do not endorse this sale of arms to the Saudis without some reservations, however. Saudi Arabia has not been as supportive of U.S. policies in the region as we all would have liked. I'm especially concerned about the Saudis' recent criticism of U.S. action against Libya. But this should not lead us to overlook Saudi Arabia's own firm commitment to stand as a bulwark against the extremist forces in the region. Although there is nothing in this package that the Saudis do not already have in their arsenal, I am especially concerned about the transfer of additional Stinger missiles to this volatile region of the world. These shoulder-held anti-aircraft missiles are relatively easy to transport, easy to operate, easy to hide, and in short, are terrorist dreams. This administration has embarked upon a campaign to transfer these sophisticated missiles to various forces throughout the world, including guerrilla groups in Afghanistan and Angola. The danger is increasing that they will fall into terrorist hands. We should never transfer such weapons without receiving strict assurances as to their use. And finally, it always gives me pause to consider how much of our nation's foreign policy today depends upon cementing a military tie with other nations. I do not believe the proliferation of arms throughout the world serves the long-term interest of peace. But each arms sale, I think, must be considered on its own terms, must be balanced against the security needs of that time and place. I understand the serious objections of many of my colleagues have to this sale, and I share many of these concerns. But I believe that it is in the interest of this nation, in the interest of the stability of the Middle East, to go forward with this package. Now is not the time to turn our backs on a pro-Western state in the Arab world. Adoption of this resolution would send the wrong signal to our allies, to the Soviet Union, and to the forces of terror in the region. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Lagomasino, a member of our committee.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I support the proposed sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia, and am puzzled as to why so many of my colleagues have rallied against this sale. The Israelis are not objecting to it. The AIPAC, the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee, is not opposed to the sale. If the Saudi acquisition of these missiles is a threat to Israel, as many of my colleagues claim, I'm confident that the Israelis would let us know about it. Mr. Chairman, as you know, the United States is not selling anything new to the Saudis. The missiles in question are kinds the Saudis have bought before, integrated into their armed services, and successfully kept from irresponsible hands. This sale is simply a resupply. Iran's increasingly belligerent behavior and aggressiveness against the moderate oil-rich Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, makes the need for this resupply even greater. It is in America's national interest to keep the Persian Gulf stable and its oil flowing. This proposed missile sale will help us succeed in this goal. Should this routine resupply be blocked, it could be detrimental to American foreign policy in the Middle East. While the U.S. strike against Libya was a justified attack against terrorism, which I strongly support, it did put moderate pro-Western Arab states like Saudi Arabia in a very difficult position. Our failure to supply Saudi Arabia with the necessary missiles for its defense would signal that the United States cannot distinguish between radical Arab states that practice terror and moderate Arab states that seek protection. This, Mr. Chairman, would be disastrous. In addition, the refusal to sell these missiles to the Saudis would force them to look elsewhere for their defensive needs. You may recall that last year, after we decided not to sell F-15s to the Saudis, they purchased billions of dollars worth of comparable British Tornado aircraft. Similarly, if we turn down this request, the Saudis will turn to the Europeans, again denying American industry millions in business.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
Further exacerbating our trade deficit and presenting a threat of such weapons falling into the hands of terrorists and others. Again, the opposition to this sale has little substance. The Saudis need this resupply. Israeli security is not endangered. The Israelis, as I said, are not even objecting to this proposed sale. And finally, as the President and the State Department correctly warned, failure to support the legitimate security needs of our moderate Arab friends like Saudi Arabia will severely damage our policy in the Middle East and will force America's other allies to question our credibility and commitments to them. I urge my colleagues to support the President's proposed sale and to turn down the resolution.
New suit, huh? Time of the gentleman has again expired. Gentleman from California.
May I ask the Chair how much time remains on both sides?
The gentleman from California has 28 minutes. The gentleman from Michigan has 30 minutes.
Thank you. I yield to the gentleman from California, my friend Mr. Edwards, for a unanimous consent request.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I rise in favor of the resolution and ask unanimous consent to extend my remarks.
Objection.
I thank the gentleman. I yield to the distinguished gentleman from New York for 2 minutes.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes. Objection.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition, in strong support of the House resolution and in strong opposition to this proposed sale of missiles to the Saudis. One of the great myths of all time is that the Saudis are a moderate state and that in some indefinable way they have been helping us to provide peace and stability in the Middle East. Nothing could be further from the truth. And the exact opposite is the case. The Saudis have consistently, over the years, sabotaged American efforts to provide peace and stability in the Middle East. Not only have they undercut the Camp David agreement at every point along the line, they tried to punish Egypt for making peace with Israel. To this very day, they're attempting to obstruct Egypt's effort as a truly moderate Arab state to reestablish her relations in the Arab world after the assassination of President Anwar Sadat. The Saudis thwarted the September 1982 effort of President Reagan to spawn his peace initiative by threatening to impose economic sanctions on Jordan if King Hussein entered into any kind of direct negotiations with the Israelis. And they repeatedly undermined King Hussein's attempt to overcome the PLO veto. The Saudis undermined American policies in Lebanon by refusing to fulfill their direct promise to use their leverage on Syria to persuade the Syrians to withdraw from Lebanon. And instead of doing that, after the United States had negotiated an agreement with the Israelis to withdraw from Lebanon, they urged the United States to scrap the treaty, and then they denounced our country for its presence in Lebanon. If anything, they are among the most destructive forces for peace and stability and the Camp David process in the Middle East. Not only that, Mr. Chairman, their record is clear. As a main promoter and financer of international terrorism. They are the only country. Can I ask unanimous consent for one additional minute?
I do not have the time. I'm sorry.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, 2 minutes. The distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Shao, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. I thank the distinguished ranking member of the committee for yielding this time to me. This debate that we're having today will raise a number of issues and has raised a number of issues about this proposed sale. Some say these weapons pose a threat to Israel, but in point of fact, they are a replenishment of weapons that are already there and present no new capabilities and hence no new threat that doesn't already exist. Secondly, they are defensive weapons that are necessary for the Saudis. Some will say, well, they're unnecessary. They already have plenty and no more are needed. Well, maybe that's correct, but the Saudis believe that they need some more, and if they are unnecessary, then what is the argument about? Third, they could fall into the hands of terrorists, it's claimed. If the weapons already exist there, that threat already exists, but in point of fact, the Saudis' record on controlling the weapons they have has been impeccable. I believe that there's only one issue in this debate that matters, and that issue is, can the word of the President of the United States be relied upon by countries in the Middle East? If you have a situation like this where there's a proposed sale that does not present a threat to Israel, that may even be unnecessary, and the President can't deliver on it because of obstruction from Congress, it will completely undermine his credibility to be able to pursue the peace process and play a constructive role in the Middle East. So the issue is this. It's not, are these a threat to Israel? Are they necessary? Could they fall into the hands of terrorists? Have the Saudis been doing enough?
The issue is, can the word of the President of the United States be relied upon by countries in the Middle East, or does he have any credibility at all? And if he lacks credibility, then he cannot play a constructive role in bringing a just and lasting peace to the region. I urge my colleagues to support our President on this arms sale, to support his word and his credibility so that he can play a constructive role in achieving peace in a region, a peace arrangement that we all desire.
Would the gentleman yield, Chairman yield him 2 additional minutes?
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentleman from California 2 additional minutes.
The gentleman is recognized for 2 additional minutes.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman has made excellent arguments that were echoed by myself and Congressman Hyde earlier. But I think to clarify a statement made by the sponsor, Mr. Levine, on how hard the administration was fighting to really be out front on this issue. And I think that the administration, out of courtesy to AIPAC and the Jewish leaders in America, deliberately was not out front. And let me just read from a speech which was made by Tom Dine before AIPAC's annual meeting just the other day, in which he said, and I think this backs up exactly what you've just said. This is Mr. Tom Dine, the executive director of AIPAC. He said, "We decided not to fight an arms sale because in our best judgment, the cost of a confrontation at this time would have been greater than the marginal benefit of stopping the arms sale." And listen to this now, because this is important. He goes on to say, "It is our function to examine, evaluate the facts in the case, and there we found that there was a consensus among defense experts and the Jewish leaders throughout America associated with all factions and all schools of thought that this particular package would have questionable impact on the security of Israel. The most authoritative study conducted found that this package would add little of consequence to the existing overall threat to Israel." And the statement goes on and on. But that is why the administration was not out in front, and that's why we thought that this would simply be a matter of having it approved.
Will the gentleman yield?
I'd be happy to yield.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. We've heard a number of times this allegation about AIPAC and about Israel. The reality is that, frankly, neither one of them are involved in this process. And for the first time, we can, in fact, examine an arms sale in open light without any kind of inherent pressure being placed by anybody. And we are trying to examine it on that basis.
The time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield to the distinguished gentleman from New Mexico 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection. Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, the definition of friends of the United States has been called into question lately with our Libyan bombing and the European response. And I'm prepared to support a sale for Saudi Arabia if the Saudis demonstrate, quote, the similar kind of friendship. They have not done so. There are 5 fundamental reasons why this sale should be rejected. First, the Saudis support the PLO and their terrorism. Secondly, they've continued to undermine the Middle East peace process, failing to support moderate Arab states like Jordan and Egypt. And thirdly, they joined enthusiastically in the condemnation of our Libyan bombing raid. The State Department has said that the Saudis have made this sale a test of our reliability and credibility in terms of our relationship. And I would like to say to the Saudis that I'm prepared to be their friend as a member of Congress. I'm prepared, I think, in the future to support these sales if they do the same with us.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Norm Lamb.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute. Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in support of the resolution of disapproval. The reasons for opposing this sale are clear. Saudi Arabia is still at a state of war with Israel. The Saudis refuse to recognize Israel's right to exist and continue to support the Arab boycott of Israel. Through these actions, the Saudis have, in fact, undermined prospects for peace in that volatile area of the world. In addition, the evident alliance between Libya's Muammar Gaddafi and Saudi Arabia is of great concern to me. The Saudis condemned our most recent attempt to end Colonel Gaddafi's reign of terror and brutality and have demonstrated a reluctance to take action against terrorism. So I urge my colleagues to oppose this ill-advised sale and to press for the peaceful resolution of disputes in that troubled region.
Gentleman yield.
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman.
I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of the gentleman and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection. Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Texas.
Gentleman's recognized.
Gentleman for yielding. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Objection.
Mr. Chairman, I commend my friend from California, Mr. Levine, for his efforts and leadership in opposing the Saudi arms sale. Today, we're not considering the security or military merits of the proposed arms sales to Saudi Arabia. How can anyone justify an arms package which would provide the Saudis with more Sidewinder missiles per plane than we provide our Air Force? And who can justify the sale of the current security threat facing the Saudis when the arms will not be delivered until the end of the decade? What we're considering today is, what signal do we want to send the Saudis? Today we're considering whether our support for Saudi Arabia has been reciprocated. An arms sale at this time will mean support for a country that just condemned our policy towards Libya, a country that financially assists terrorist organizations in states like the PLO in Syria, a country that has engaged in an oil embargo against us, a country that consistently seeks to undermine our peace efforts in the region, a country that is still at war with Israel. The Saudis have actively opposed the Camp David Accords, which form the cornerstone of our efforts to bring the Arab-Israeli conflict of peaceful resolution. They have ostracized Egypt, the only Arab partner to the Camp David Accords, and have threatened Jordan with sanctions if it were to join the peace process. From this record, we can not only conclude that Saudi support for our efforts to bring stability to a volatile region of the world has been poor at best, while we consistently attend to the Saudi security needs. Mr. Chairman, it is time that we send a signal disapproving of Saudi behavior. I urge my colleagues, therefore, to join me in an overwhelming vote for this resolution.
The gentleman from Michigan.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Washington, Mr. Miller.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes. Without objection.
I thank our distinguished minority leader, Foreign Affairs Committee, for yielding to me. There may be a time when the U.S. should sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, but I believe this is not the time. This is a request for air weapons in 1989 by a nation that claims to face a ground threat in 1986. This is a request for weapons by a nation that has reneged on promises to help the Mideast peace process and has gone on bankrolling terrorist groups. This is a request for weapons by a nation that has deprived its citizens of the most basic human rights. This is a request for weapons by a nation that votes against us in the UN as much as some of the Warsaw Pact countries. Now, no one or even two of these reasons by itself means the U.S. should refuse this sale. But all these reasons together tell us that this is not the time for such a sale. Mr. Chairman, I yield back to the distinguished minority leader of the Foreign Affairs Committee.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Obey.
Gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I find myself in a difficult position today. I believe that the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hamilton, and gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Hyde, are essentially correct. I think the sale does nothing to threaten the security of Israel. And I think that those of you who know me know that I go to great lengths to try to help promote decent relations with moderate Arab states, including having twice met with Mr. Arafat. I know that sometimes the lengths to which I go cause extreme discomfiture for some of my friends in the House.
I believe it's in Israel's interest for the United States to have close relations with moderate Arab states, including Saudi Arabia, who I regard as being pro-West. But I just have to say that under this administration, despite the efforts of Assistant Secretary Murphy, and despite more than the $32 billion the Congress has made available to this administration, we have not seen one major step in the peace process in more than 5 years. Maybe the issues are tougher than they used to be. I don't know. But we will never really find out unless we see real efforts and unless we see the expenditure of real political capital to try to do more than just sell arms. And my concern is that it appears that as of this moment, arms sales are effectively substituting for policy in the Middle East. Under these circumstances, I think it's important that we send a message to the administration to get off the dime, to move the peace process forward, which includes asking both the Arabs and the Israelis to do a number of things which they don't want to do. I think the only way to get the message across to the administration is to vote against this arms sale. And let us be very frank about it. The White House has not lifted one finger to support this arms sale. If the White House gave as much attention to the need to revive the Middle East peace process as they do to try to get military aid to the Contras in Nicaragua or aid to a half-baked group of rebels in Angola, this would be a different story on this vote. I will be perfectly willing to reconsider my position on the veto override if the administration can demonstrate that they in fact do have a plan other than arms sales to promote the peace process in the Middle East. I am anxious to try to participate in that process, but I don't believe that focusing on Nicaragua, focusing on Angola, and ignoring the effort, the responsibility to move the peace process forward is a real way to build a constructive relationship with moderate Arab states in the Middle East. I want to cooperate in a real effort to do so, but so far I don't see any effort that I regard as really being real.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman,
Mr. Chairman, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Nielsen.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I ask permission to rise and expend my remarks. Mr. Chairman, I spent some time in the Middle East. I worked at the Ford Foundation at Jordan as an economic advisor in 1970. I worked for Stanford Research on a business census in Lebanon in 1956. I picked 2 war-torn years, as it turns out. I also have taught at the American University of Beirut. I think I understand the Arab people. I want to make one point clear. There are 2 kinds of Arab people, at least 2 kinds, those which have been friendly consistently to the United States and those which have been opposed to the United States. Saudi Arabia has been very friendly to the United States. My colleague from Washington said they'd voted against us in the UN. They had a much better record of voting with us on the UN than most of our other to whom we send supplies. This is not I might say this is not a grant or a loan. This is a sale. These are weapons which they already have and which they will buy other places if they don't get them from us. If they buy them from us, they have some safeguards. If they buy them from someone else, we have no safeguards. Israel is not opposing this sale. In my opinion, we should support the sale and oppose this.
Gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Massachusetts.
I thank the gentleman and I thank him for his leadership on this. I'm a little puzzled at the emphasis some of my colleagues have given on the fact that Israel, and we were told AIPAC and some American Jewish leaders didn't oppose the sale. Sometimes I get the feeling that I'll get criticized if I do what Israel recommends, and then I'll get criticized if I don't do what Israel recommends, and I would really like to set Israel aside at this point and talk about American policy. The first thing this does, I'm holding the country reports on human rights practices for 1985 in my hand. Any suggestion that Ronald Reagan is motivated by unhappiness at the lack of freedom in Nicaragua to want to send money to make war on them is totally exploded if you read the report on human rights in Saudi Arabia to which he wants to send all these arms. Saudi Arabia makes Nicaragua look like the Democratic Convention of 1968 in terms of freedom. Next, we have the question of, well, aren't the Saudis doing things that are sometimes in our interest? Sure they are. Whenever the Saudis see that something is in their own interest and it happens to coincide with ours, they do it. I don't object to a policy of trying to woo moderate Arabs. I don't object to a policy of trying to woo moderate anybody's. I object to our being the cheapest state in the world. The Saudi Arabians buy America with the lowest level of cooperation and support I have ever seen. Yes, they agree with us that they don't want to see Iran take over. But do the Saudis resist Iranian takeover of their country or a Russian takeover of their country as a favor to us? If I were the king of Saudi Arabia, exercising the absolute power with all the money that is characterized in this human rights report, I wouldn't think that my resistance to being taken over by Iran or the Soviet Union was something I did solely as a favor to the United States. They were people who helped denounce Anwar Sadat for his act of courage and freedom. They have been supportive with money of Libya and the PLO. They simply have never, when their interests in any way conflicted with ours, done anything for us. Yes, we have some congruent interests with the Saudis. We both want to see resistance to some extremism. We can get that cooperation without buying it.
The gentleman has expired. Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to inquire of the leader on the other side how many speakers he has left.
Two minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my distinguished friend and want to commend him on his leadership in this effort. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Speaker, as a co-sponsor of H.A. Res. 589, I rise to support the resolution and oppose the sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia. The administration argues that the U.S. must once more prove its support for the Saudi sheikhdom by approving yet again another shipment of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I fail to see what the Saudi government is doing in return for the support we have constantly offered them. After supplying the Saudi government with almost $50 billion in military equipment and services over the last 33 years, we might finally expect some show of sympathy from the Saudis for our policies in the Middle East, for stopping terrorism, for recognizing Israel, and for promoting a peace settlement between Israel and her neighbors. Instead, Saudi Arabia continues to greet our concerns in the Middle East with hostility. The administration has not only failed to make its case for a sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia, it has brought to Congress a proposal that would only further escalate the Middle East arms race. We need only recall America's policy of arming Iran to the teeth to see the deadly consequences of a policy that tries to promote stability with weapons, a policy that favors military force over diplomacy. In fact, it is American weaponry in the hands of the now fundamentalist Iranian government
We have, Mr. Broomfield, 3 who are present, but we have 7 who have requested time and who the other 4 indicated they'd be returning, so I'm just not sure if they'll get back to the floor or not.
I only have the Republican leader left, and I wonder if you would proceed, and then we'll close.
Why don't we just go through those who are here and see where that takes us? How much, may I inquire how much time is remaining on both sides?
The gentleman has 18 minutes on your side, 23 minutes on Mr. Broomfield's side.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New York.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank my distinguished friend and want to commend him on his leadership in this effort. And, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Speaker, as a co-sponsor of H.A. Res. 589, I rise to support the resolution and oppose the sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia. The administration argues that the U.S. must once more prove its support for the Saudi sheikhdom by approving yet again another shipment of weapons to Saudi Arabia. I fail to see what the Saudi government is doing in return for the support we have constantly offered them. After supplying the Saudi government with almost $50 billion in military equipment and services over the last 33 years, we might finally expect some show of sympathy from the Saudis for our policies in the Middle East, for stopping terrorism, for recognizing Israel, and for promoting a peace settlement between Israel and her neighbors. Instead, Saudi Arabia continues to greet our concerns in the Middle East with hostility. The administration has not only failed to make its case for a sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia, it has brought to Congress a proposal that would only further escalate the Middle East arms race. We need only recall America's policy of arming Iran to the teeth to see the deadly consequences of a policy that tries to promote stability with weapons, a policy that favors military force over diplomacy. In fact, it is American weaponry in the hands of the now fundamentalist Iranian government that the administration today says is threatening the Saudis. Our mission in the Middle East must be to ensure Israel's security and promote peace, not to scatter our military hardware to any nation that wants it. The sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia is dangerous and wrong and should be stopped.
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield 5 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Florida, Mr. Smith.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, today I rise in support of H.J. Res. 589 to bar the sale of missiles to Saudi Arabia. The administration's raison d'etre for this proposed sale was stated very succinctly by National Security Advisor John Poindexter in today's Washington Post. It centers on the fact that, quote, Saudi Arabia is a major player in the Middle East and a good friend of the United States. Furthermore, quote, our interests require that we help the Saudis meet their legitimate security needs in the face of growing regional threats. Well, let's examine those quotes and the facts. Firstly, while the Saudis have been a major player in the Middle East, all right, they have done so at the expense of and in opposition to U.S. goals in the region. The Saudis have continued to reject all efforts to bring about direct negotiations between Israel and its neighbors and have opposed the Camp David Accords. Never once have they offered to help the King of Jordan or support Jordan in its attempt to get to the bargaining table in direct negotiations. They have undermined King Hussein's efforts to involve Jordan in the process and isolate and continue to isolate the one neighboring Arab country which in fact gave support to Jordan, which was Egypt. Their support was to refuse to allow the Egyptians back into any of the Arab leagues. By far the most damning of Saudi Arabia's policies is its bankrolling, as you've heard, of both the PLO and Syria, protectors of terrorists, perpetrators of murderous acts all over the world against Americans and other countries, and they support them to the tune, I might add, of almost $100 million a year to the PLO and about $500 million a year to the Syrians. In addition, while the United States has attempted to bring peace to the region, the Saudis have yet to terminate the declaration of the state of war that they made back in 1967, and in fact, technically are still at war with Israel. Secondly, how does this sale help Saudi Arabia meet its current security needs? Iran is the chief threat to Saudi Arabia. Everyone in this government agrees to it. In fact, the Middle East Arms Transfer Study talked about it as well. There's no question about it. And the war between Iran and Iraq is being waged and threatens, according to that study and everyone else, Saudi Arabia. But what's the threat? The threat is ground troops. The Saudis are outnumbered scores to one with ground troops. The Saudis have very little in the way of really effective ground armament. And yet, we want to sell them anti-aircraft missiles. Nobody ever shot down a soldier with a harpoon or a Sidewinder or a Stinger. In fact, we are giving them, if we make this sale, we are giving them more of what they have as the greatest strength. missiles. They need ground infantry equipment, and we want to give them missiles. Iran has less than 50 air-capable planes left in their air force. The missiles wouldn't even be delivered to the Saudis until 1989, making any argument of urgency pure nonsense. In addition, as you've heard, the sale includes 800 Stinger missiles, which is of particular concern to all of us. This handheld missile is the ideal terrorist weapon, and all of us shudder at the thought of sending them to a part of the world where terrorism is the name of the game and the game is played every day. If this administration is worried about the possible diversion of Stingers recently sent to the rebels in Afghanistan and Angola, can we really trust these weapons to a government that continues to finance the PLO and the Syrians? Finally, the Saudis already possess more missiles per aircraft than all of our NATO allies. I request two additional minutes.
I yield 2 additional minutes to the gentleman from Florida.
Recognized for 2 additional minutes.
This sale would give them even more missiles per plane than the United States of America. In addition, they've received $44 billion in American military equipment and services since 1970, $22 billion in the last 5 years alone. I think this demonstrates an American understanding of the legitimate security needs of a modern Arab state and our willingness to help them, which is why every request has been granted. But why is every request for an arms sale a litmus test? Every one is a test of our friendship. Isn't $44 billion worth of sales enough to prove our friendship over the last 25 years? Do we have to prove it every day? How about a little proof on the other side? We've been reflexive in granting those requests, but it hasn't promoted or prompted Saudi cooperation. It hasn't resulted in the U.S. having its peace initiatives advanced by Saudi Arabia. In fact, selling arms seems to be the only policy that they agree with us in the Middle East, irrespective of our own sensitivity to our own interests in the Middle East. This is our only policy, a policy I call the carrot and stick. We give them all the carrots they want, and then we beat ourselves over the head with the stick. Let's finally get a little quid pro quo. How about just a little cooperation in policy? And in closing, let me just debunk this argument, and you heard Mr. Frank say it well, about AIPAC and about Israel. Israel opposes an arms sale, every arms sale, to every country that is at war with her, with her. And this country is at war with her, and Israel opposes this one as well. That is the pronouncement of the Israeli government. And AIPAC,
Gentleman has again
I ask the gentleman for 1 additional minute. Would the gentleman yield? Does the gentleman have 1 additional minute?
Only 1 additional
I thank the gentleman. And AIPAC, they sent, excuse me, they sent a letter to the Senate just 2 days ago, putting themselves on record that they were opposed to the sale, but were not going to fight it. That's all. They are not in favor of this sale, but in any event, it doesn't make any difference. This is a foreign policy issue, and Israel and AIPAC and the Jews in this country, of which I'm one, have nothing to do with it. This is a foreign policy issue. Shall we keep selling arms to a country that does not advance our interests for peace in the Middle East and finances terrorism and finances countries that sponsor terrorism? Or shall we say, now, before you get any more arms from us, we want you to give us a little help to achieve peace? What greater role could we all play than being part of a process that achieves peace in the Middle East?
Time of the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Jones.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I rise as a co-sponsor and strong supporter of this resolution. In 1981, the President made a powerful plea in support of a sale of AWACS aircraft to Saudi Arabia.
Now, while this body overwhelmingly rejected that plea, the other body went along with the President. In my judgment, that was a serious error. In 1979, the Camp David Accords, the United States sent a clear message to the Arab world that we would support those moderate Arab states who pursued peace with Israel. In 1981, by failing to overturn the AWACS sale, the United States sent another clear message to the Arab world, and that is peace with Israel is no longer a criterion for U.S. weapons sales. Mr. Speaker, today we must undo the damage of the 1981 AWACS vote. Today we must send a signal to the Arab world, to Israel and the administration, that the United States Congress supports the State of Israel more than ever, and that the price of arms sales is peace with Israel. Mr. Speaker, this is a test vote. Last year, the administration backed off a proposed arms deal with Jordan because they read the tea leaves and foresaw an embarrassing defeat. Later this year, we will be asked to finalize the AWACS sale, and the administration will again be reading the tea leaves and proceed on that basis. And Congress must draw the line now. We must send an unequivocal message that we will never support an arms sale to a country which has not pursued peace with Israel. We must undo the error of AWACS and prevent it from occurring in the future. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to support this resolution prohibiting the missile sale to Saudi Arabia.
Now the gentleman has expired. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, might I inquire of the distinguished leader on the other side? We now have one final speaker, and I don't know what the gentleman's desire is at this point.
Mr. Chairman, if the gentleman would yield, we have just two, one for 1 minute and then the Republican leader to wind it up.
What? Go ahead.
I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Virginia, West Virginia, Mr. Ray Hall.
Gentleman's recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Michigan for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of President Reagan in this proposed arms sale to the country of Saudi Arabia. We've heard many myths exerted during the course of the debate today, Mr. Chairman. We've heard how the Saudis have not been cooperative with American peace efforts in the Middle East. We've heard how these weapons may get in the hands of terrorists in the region. And we've heard how it is only going to inflame the passions of the region and work to the detriment of Israel's best interest. One by one, Mr. Chairman, very quickly, I think it's important, and many other speakers have shown how the Israelis have supported the American interest or how the Saudis have supported the American interest in bringing about peace in the Middle East. It's also worth noting that it was the Saudis who defeated a Libyan-backed resolution in the League of Arab Nations a few months ago that would have imposed economic sanctions against the United States. In regard to the potential for these weapons getting into the hands of terrorists, I think it's important to note that the Stinger weapon is of such a magnitude and such a size that it's very hard to get those weapons through airport security. And indeed, we've attached strings to our sales that other countries do not impose if the Saudis are forced to go to other countries to buy these weapons. It's important to, I think, note what Tom Dine, the executive director of AIPAC, has said, and I quote, "Every defense analysis that we have gone to, American and Israeli, government and non-governmental, have analyzed this missile sale as not affecting significance the balance of military power in the region." Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, this is a cash deal, no grants, no forgiven credits. It's cash on the barrelhead, and it's in America's best interest to proceed with this sale. Thank you.
Gentleman from California.
I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Durbin.
Gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We receive reports regularly from the jungles of Central America that the fighting that is taking place there is involving weapons on both sides of United States origin, weapons which we provide and weapons left over from previous conflicts. It is entirely possible that if there is some future war involving the United States, that our own combat troops will face hostile fire from American weapons. It is obvious that the United States military sales overseas over the last several decades have not been tightly circumscribed. We have dealt in volume, we have sold to willing customers, and we have hoped that the rules of international conduct and our own intelligence sources were enough to protect us from those weapons ever firing back on the United States.
Today we're considering a resolution where the Reagan administration is asking to sell $354 million in new missiles to Saudi Arabia. Among those missiles are included 800 Stingers, a very important and critical weapon in today's world. I'm the co-sponsor of legislation with Congressman O'Coin of Oregon to prohibit the sale of Stinger missiles to paramilitary and guerrilla groups around the world for the very reason that these missiles, handheld and mobile, can be used as the most effective terrorist weapon in the world today. All of the time and effort we put into airport security to make certain that American planes are not destroyed in air would be lost by one Stinger missile 5 miles away from an aircraft that could strike an American plane or any plane. To proliferate these missiles, to put them out into commerce around the world, is to invite disaster. The rules of international conflict require that we craft our policy to the realities of today's world. Prudence requires us to reconsider the realities that face us with this Saudi sale. Present time, the Saudis have some 300 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, 100 Harpoon missiles, and 400 Stingers. There is no need for 800 more Stingers that could invite terrorist reprisals against the United States and its citizens.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, before I yield the time to the Republican leader, I'd like unanimous consent that I insert my own remarks following those of the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Fassel, on this issue.
Without objection. Gentleman from...
I yield the gentleman from Illinois, the Republican leader, as much time as he may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman. Ask unanimous consent to revise
Without
and extend
objection.
my remarks. Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I rise in opposition to the resolution to disapprove the sale of the $354 million worth of missiles to Saudi Arabia, and I do so under no illusions concerning the atmosphere in which this debate takes place. I can count too, but I thought it'd be useful to offer some arguments in favor of the sale, if only to put in perspective some ideas that might be lost in the stampede against the sale. We all know that Israel is as much a part of this debate as Saudi Arabia, and it is this point that I ought to address myself first. For almost 30 years now, I've been speaking for and voting for policies that support the survival and the freedom and security of the State of Israel. I believe support for the security and survival of Israel, the cornerstone of our Mideast policy for over 40 years, is in no way threatened by the sale of defensive weapons to Saudi Arabia. And that's not just Bob Michael's view. As has been pointed out several times, Mr. Tom Dine, Executive Director of the American-Israeli Political Affairs Committee, recently stated, the gentleman from West Virginia alluded to it but didn't quite finish the quotation. I think it bears repeating. Every defense analyst that we have gone to, American and Israeli, governmental and non-governmental, has analyzed this missile sale as not affecting the balance of military power in the region. You have to be honest about that. So said Tom Dine. So we have a situation in which those in the House opposed to the sale are supposedly more pro-Israel than AIPAC, something most observers would find hard to believe. I believe Mr. Dine has made a contribution to this debate, which is worthy of the attention of all of us, no matter what side you're on. The sale would not add new systems to the Saudi arms inventory. What is involved is either an upgrading or an augmentation of equipment already in Saudi stocks. And each part of the sale meets a specific and urgent need for the Saudis against attacks from radical states such as Iran. The Sidewinders, as we know, are short-range air-to-air missiles that will enhance the ability of the Saudi Air Force to be effective in air combat. The Harpoon missile is needed against naval threats in the Gulf region. And the Stingers provide close-range defense of key installations, including those vital oil fields. Now remember, in the spring of 1984, and I might call the gentleman from Florida's attention to his reference to ground troops and that kind of thing. In the spring of '84, the Royal Saudi Air Force pilots flying F-15s downed 2 intruding Iranian aircraft. And that's where the threat comes from some of those more radical countries. The Iranians obviously got the message, but we can't depend upon them remembering that lesson because Iran is not certainly acting logically these days. So we have to help the Saudis prepare for whatever plausible threat might come from that area. Saudi Arabia is as large as the eastern half of the United States. It has only 60 combat fighters to protect that enormous area. And it seems to me they need all the help they can get in that regard. The timing of the sale is almost as important as its substance. Even though these weapons won't get to Saudi Arabia immediately, the fact we made the commitment, I think, will in itself be useful. I'm aware of the fear that stingers sent to the Saudis might fall into the hands of terrorists or radical Islamic states. The gentleman who just preceded me in the well alluded to that fact. But I believe the security safeguards that we impose as part of the sale and the record of the Saudis over 40 years, while not a definitive argument against such a fear, is extremely compelling. And if we don't sell them these weapons, let's face it, other countries will. And there won't be then that same security that we impose on the sale of those weapons. The argument is raised that the Saudis, because they have not always acted in line with our policies, are unworthy of our aid. Well, given the complex politics of the Arab and Islamic world, it's a small wonder that the Saudis have not always acted the way we would wish them to act. But we can make this same accusation about some of our closest allies and within the last couple weeks. I don't believe I have to name names. Sovereign nations do what they feel they have to do, and the Saudis are no different from anyone else. It's my understanding that in recent months the Saudis have been quietly helpful in at least one issue of major concern to us. And I think what we're talking about here is, if you consider Jordan and the Saudis and Egypt as moderate Arab countries as distinguished from those more radical ones, I think it's to our advantage to keep the door of communication open with those moderate Arab countries that in turn have ties with the radicals for at least maybe a bit of help from time to time. I think it's useful for us, as I said, to keep those lines open and not turn our back when they're asking for aid, especially when they will not be denied the aid but merely buy it from someone else. The recent catastrophe in Chernobyl in the Soviet Union reminds us that the problem of energy supplies is one that confronts us again and again with no definitive answer. I don't think we can shut our eyes to the fact that Saudi Arabia has 25% of the world's proven oil reserves. This fact alone, not just the Saudis' relationship with Israel, commands our attention. Let me recall your attention to Jimmy Carter's State of the Union address back in January 23, 1980, when he said, "An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force." Now, that was called the Carter Doctrine back in those days. It committed this nation to send Americans to fight and die to protect our access to oil. I believe it is far, far better to send defensive weapons to the Saudis today than to have to send American rapid deployment forces under some variation of that Carter Doctrine maybe tomorrow or beyond. For many years, under presidents of both parties, it has been the policy of the United States to guarantee Israel's freedom and security while at the same time having friendly relations with these moderate Arab states. This sale is a continuation of that great bipartisan tradition. Israel has nothing to fear from this sale, but both Israel and the United States have much to fear if radical states of the Middle East believe they can attack moderate Arab states with impunity. And a vote against this resolution will go a long way toward helping our nation continue to meet its commitments in the Middle East. And that, after all, is what is important to us. Our own national self-interest, our own Mideast policies, our own geostrategic goals and our own values. And these alone ought to determine our choice and our vote today. Speaker or Chairman, I yield back to balance.
Gentleman from California.
We have no further request for time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Mr. Chairman, I have no further request for time.
Clerk will read.
Resolved that the issuance of a letter of offer with respect to
California.
Unanimous consent that the resolution be considered as read.
Without objection. Are there amendments to the resolution? The gentleman have a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee do now rise and report the joint resolution to the House with the recommendation that the joint resolution do pass.
Questions on the motion? Those in favor say aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Committee rises. Speaker.
Mr. Chairman.
The Committee of the Whole House and the State of the Union, having had under consideration the House J Resolution 589, directs me to report the same back to the House with a recommendation that the bill do now pass.
Thank you, sir. The Chairman of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee, having had under consideration House Joint Resolution 589, directs him to report the same back to the House with the recommendation that the bill do pass. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on engrossment and third reading of the bill. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Reading.
Joint resolution prohibiting the proposed sale of certain missiles to Saudi Arabia.
Questions on final passage of the bill. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. Bill is passed.
Mr. Speaker, I object on the grounds that a quorum is not present. Make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Will count for a quorum. It's obvious that a quorum is not present. Rules, a vote is automatic. Those in favor will vote aye. Those opposed will vote no. Voting will be by electronic device.
ayes are 356, the nays are 62. The resolution is agreed to. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table Senate Joint Resolution S-316, prohibiting the sale to Saudi Arabia of certain defense articles and related defense services, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
Clerk will report the title of the Senate Joint Resolution. Clerk will suspend. The House will be in order.
So,
the House will be in order. The House will be in order. There is further business on this issue. Yeah, right. The clerk will report the title of the Senate Joint Resolution.
Senate Joint Resolution 316, Joint Resolution prohibiting the sale of Saudi Arabia of certain defense articles and related defense services.
Is there objection to the present consideration of the Senate Joint Resolution? Chair hears none. Without objection, Senate Joint Resolution is read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, a similar House Joint Resolution is laid upon the table. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on the resolution just passed.
Without objection. Gentlelady from Ohio.
Unanimous consent that I be allowed to put my statement on the previous bill just voted on immediately before the vote.
Objection. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Pepper, is recognized for the purpose of filing a rule. Gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order.
I sent to the desk a privileged report from the Committee on Rules for filing under the rule.
Report the title of
Report to accompany House Resolution 448, waiving certain points of order against consideration of H.R. 4515, making urgent supplemental appropriations for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 1986, and for other purposes.
Referred to the House calendar and print and ordered printed. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Garcia.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution H.J. Res. 492 to designate the week beginning June 1st, 1986 as National Neighborhood Housing Services Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
House Joint Resolution 492, Joint Resolution to designate the month of June 1, 1986
Is there
as
objection?
National
Mr. Speaker,
Neighborhood
reserving the right
Housing
to
Services
object.
Week.
Gentleman will suspend. The House will be in order. Gentleman from Utah.
I do not object, but simply like to inform the House that the minority has no objection to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, under my reservation, I would like to yield to the gentleman from New York.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I would like to invite my colleagues to join with me in celebrating National Theater Week from June 1 through June 7, 1986. This week will celebrate 302 years of theatrical entertainment in America.
Mr. Speaker, House is not in order.
May we get some order, please? House will be in order.
And that over there.
He's got the floor. Gentleman from Utah.
Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection. Without objection, the joint resolution is engrossed, read a third time, passed. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution SJ Res 281 to designate the week of May 11th, 1986 to May 17th, 1986 as Senior Center Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Put the title.
On a joint resolution 281, joint resolution to designate the week of May 11th through May 17th, 1986 as Senior Center Week.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object, but simply like to inform the House that the minority has no objection to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, is he here? I withdraw my reservation.
May we have order, please? The gentleman's entitled to be heard. Gentleman from Utah reserves the right to object.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, the joint resolution is read a third time and passed. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution SJ Res 324 to designate the week beginning May 18, 1986 as National Digestive Diseases Awareness Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
Senate Joint Resolution 324, joint resolution to designate the week beginning May 18, 1986 as National Digestive Diseases Awareness Week.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker, reserving the right to
Gentleman
object.
from Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object, simply like to inform the House that the minority has no objection to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, the joint resolution is read a third time and passed. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution SJ Res 247 to designate the week of June 1st through June 7th, 1986 as National Theater Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
Senate Joint Resolution 247, joint resolution to designate the week of June 1 through June 7, 1986 as National Theater Week.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker, reserving the right to
Gentleman
object.
from Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object, simply like to inform the House that the minority has no objections to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, under my reservation, I would like to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Green, who is the chief sponsor of HJ Res 464, to designate the week of June 1 through June 7, 1986 as National Theater Week.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I would like to invite my colleagues to join with me in celebrating National Theater Week from June 1 through June 7, 1986. This week will celebrate 302 years of theatrical entertainment in America. I'm bringing this to the attention of my colleagues in order to focus public attention on the increasingly important role the legitimate theater plays in the lives of our citizens. In a world full of crisis and stress, the theater provides a relaxing yet thought-provoking influence. The public has recognized this potential. Over the last 4 years, total theater attendance has increased 7%. The private sector also recognizes the significance of theater as an investment. During the same 4-year period, individual and corporate support has increased 11%. And the theater has also become recognized as a significant method of leveraging local investment. For every dollar spent at the box office, 4 are generated in local income for the food, beverage, and transportation industries. It has been my pleasure to introduce this commemorative legislation for the past 4 years. With passage of House Joint Resolution 464, we can once again commemorate this important American institution.
Without objection, the joint resolution is read a third time passed. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution HJ Res 526 to designate the week of May 25th, 1986 through May 31st, 1986 as Critical Care Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
House Joint Resolution 526, joint resolution to designate the week beginning May 25th, 1986 through May 31, 1986 as Critical Care Week.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker, reserving the right to object.
Gentleman from Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object. Simply would like to inform the House that the minority has no objections to the legislation now being considered.
Without objection, the joint resolution.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation. Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman from Utah, I beg your pardon. I thought he was concluded. Gentleman
withdraw.
further reserves the right to object.
And, Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, the joint resolution is engrossed, read a third time passed. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution S.J. Res. 267 to designate the week of May 26, 1986 through June 1st, 1986 as Older Americans Melanoma Skin Cancer Detection and Prevention Week. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
Senate Joint Resolution 267, joint resolution designating the week of May 26, 1986 through June 1, 1986 as Older Americans Melanoma Skin Cancer Detection and Prevention Week.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker, reserving the right to object.
Gentleman from Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object, but simply like to inform the House the minority has no objection to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, joint resolution is read a third time passed. The motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Post Office and Civil Service be discharged from further consideration of the joint resolution S.J. Res. 288 to designate the month of May 1986 as National Birds of Prey Month. Mr. Speaker, I ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the title.
Senate Joint Resolution 288, joint resolution to designate the month of May 1986 as National Birds of Prey Month.
Is there objection?
Mr. Speaker, reserving the right to
Gentleman from
object.
Utah reserves the right to object.
I do not object. Simply like to inform the House the minority has no objection to the legislation now being considered. Mr. Speaker, under my reservation, I would like to yield to the distinguished gentleman from Idaho, Mr. Craig, who is the chief sponsor of H.J. Res. 546, designating May 1986 as National Birds of Prey Month.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Utah for yielding. S.J. Res. 288 that passed in the Senate and H.J. Res. 546 that is now ready to pass here in the House designates May as National Birds of Prey Month. Mr. Speaker, nothing symbolizes the freedom of this nation more than its birds of prey. These majestic creatures not only play a vital role in maintaining nature's balance, but their grace, beauty, and spirit have been an inspiration to this nation for centuries. Many species of birds of prey inhabit the United States, and an alarming number of them are listed either as threatened, endangered, or now near extinction. Millions of Americans are concerned about these birds, and many are actively working for their preservation. This month marks the dedication of the Peregrine Fund's World Center for Birds of Prey in Boise, Idaho. Directed by Morley Nelson, this center is a unique wildlife resource and represents an important link in this chain of concern. The World Center for Birds of Prey will be available for use by biologists as well as visiting scientists, graduates, and undergraduate students at Boise State University. In addition to its function as a research facility, the center will serve as an information and education center for the public. And indeed, it is information and education concerning the plight of these birds that is much needed. Important strides already have been made. Last year, in its first year of operation, the World Center for Birds of Prey released 140 peregrine falcon in Idaho, Utah, Montana, and Colorado. 18 additional falcons were placed in foster nests in the state of Colorado. In October, 53 falcon were transferred to the Boise Center from Ithaca, New York, to be bred and released in our eastern states. Thus, this center actually represents a coast-to-coast nationwide involvement in a coast-to-coast nationwide concern. Designating May 1986 as National Birds of Prey Month not only will help heighten that concern, but also will assist the many individuals and organizations who are now desperately trying to ensure the continued existence of these noble birds. I thank my colleague from Utah for yielding, and yield back the balance of my time.
Speaker, I join with my colleague from Idaho for excellent remarks that he has made concerning this important subject, and I yield back withdraw my reservation.
Without objection, the joint resolution is read a third time passed. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their
Without
remarks.
objection, so ordered. Chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Mitchell of Maryland on account of official business.
Without objection, request is granted. Gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that following legislative business...
I'm sorry, the chair would kindly request the gentleman withhold for just a moment. We have one other piece of business.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw my request.
Thank you, very kind. I apologize, I got the gentleman into that.
Mr. Speaker,
I've got special order.
waiting to be recognized.
The gentleman from Oregon rise.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that in the engrossment of the bill H.R. 3214, the clerk be directed to correct the amendment on page 12 as it was before the House on May 7. 1, by striking out all of lines 9 through 14 of the bill as introduced. 2, by inserting before the text the words Section 5 of the Act of December 29, 1982, PL 97-391, is amended to read as follows. And 3, by inserting quotation marks before Section 5A before paragraph B and after the period at the end of paragraph B.
Is your objection request, the gentleman from Oregon?
Reserving the right to object.
Gentleman reserves the right to object.
Will the gentleman from Oregon yield for a brief explanation?
Gentleman has the time.
Go ahead.
You have the time.
Well, I would wish the gentleman from Oregon to explain...
Oh, will I yield for an explanation? Yes, I'd be delighted to. Sorry. If the gentleman will yield, I will explain. In preparing the papers on H.R. 3214, an error was made in the incorporation of the committee amendment. The change proposed is not a change of substance from the committee's recommendation, but simply corrects a mistake made to the text so it will read correctly.
I thank my colleague from Oregon for responding. The minority has no objection and withdraw my reservation.
Is there objection? Chair hears none. Without objection, request granted. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Seiberling.
I ask unanimous consent to take from the Speaker's table the bill H.R. 2921 and for its immediate consideration in the House.
Clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar Number 332, H.R. 2921, a bill to authorize the Secretary of Agriculture to issue permanent easements for the water conveyance systems in order to resolve title claims arising under acts repealed by Federal Land Policy Management Act of 1976 and for other purposes.
Is your objection request the gentleman from Ohio?
Speaker,
gentleman reserves the right to object.
Reserving the right to object, Mr. Speaker. I do not necessarily object. I would merely like to compliment the distinguished chairman of the Subcommittee on Public Lands for his patience and his efforts, without which there would be no bill before us. This is extremely important to the West. I would also ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on the subject of H.R. 2921. And I withdraw my reservation.
Is your objection? Chair is none.
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk and
Clerk will report the amendment.
I ask unanimous consent to consider it in lieu of the committee bill.
Is your objection? Chair hears none. Clerk will report.
An amendment offered by Mr. Seiberling of Ohio. Strike out all after the enacting clause and insert the following. Section
Mr.
1A.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that further reading of the amendment be dispensed
Is
with.
there objection? Chair hears none. Without objection, amendment's agreed to.
Mr.
Bill is
Speaker,
engrossed
without
right at
Mr.
third- Is the
Mr.
gentleman-
Speaker,
is the
reserving the
gentleman
right to object. Yes.
Gentleman's recognized.
I would like to yield to the gentleman from Ohio to explain the nature of the amendment.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the amendment is in the nature of a substitute which includes provisions adopted by the Interior Committee and some revisions made to meet concerns of the Committee on Agriculture. As a result, the bill is very similar to the House-passed bill of the last Congress dealing with this subject and is acceptable to the Forest Service and the administration. The bill addresses the status of certain irrigation ditches and similar facilities located on Western National Forest lands which were built and in use prior to the enactment of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. That act protected valid existing rights. The owners of these systems believe that that means they should be exempt from the regulatory provisions of the act and from its requirement of annual right-of-way rental payments. The Forest Service does not agree with that position. This bill would not alter that situation. It would leave the parties free to resolve the matter through litigation. The bill, however, would extend to qualified holders of existing qualified irrigation systems an option that they could exercise as an alternative to litigation over the status of their systems. That option is to agree to be subject to the general terms and conditions of the Federal Land Policy and Management Act regarding rights of way in return for assurance that the easement would be granted, that would be open-ended in duration, and would be exempt from the annual rental fees otherwise required by the Act. The substitute would limit the bill so that it would apply only to systems crossing national forest lands for which the applicants have a valid water right under state law and which were constructed and in operation prior to the specified date. The substitute also contains a number of modifications to existing law as suggested by the Forest Service in order to give them additional flexibility in managing rights of way. It's my understanding that the Forest Service and the administration have no problems with the bill as we bring it before the House, and I believe it's sound and urge its approval. And I'd be glad to answer any other questions if anyone has
Mr.
any.
Speaker, I greatly appreciate the explanation of the distinguished chairman, and again, I would express my deep gratitude for his efforts on this bill, and I withdraw my reservation.
Gentleman withdraws his reservation. Without objection, amendment is agreed to. Without objection, the bill is engrossed, read a third time, passed, and a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
I thank the distinguished speaker, and I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks on this bill. Thank you.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania now.
Are you
Chair,
sure?
I'm absolutely certain. And I apologize.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that following legislative business and any special orders heretofore entered into, that the following members may be permitted to address the House, revise and extend the remarks, and include therein extraneous matter. Mr. Livingston on today's date for 5 minutes, Mr. Bereiter today for 5 minutes, Mr. Walker also today for 60 minutes, Mr. Fish today for 15 minutes, Mr. Gilman also for today for 60 minutes. Change that.
Without objection, the sundry requests are granted. Gentleman from
Mr.
Pennsylvania.
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the following members be permitted to extend their remarks and to include additional matter in that section of the record entitled Extensions of Remarks. Mr. Smith of Oregon, 1 instance, Mr. Green 1 time, Mr. Kramer 2 instances, Mr. Whitehurst 1, Mr. Duncan 1, Mr. Dornan 1, Mr. Miller of Ohio on 3 instances, Mr. Geekus 2, that's Geekus of Pennsylvania, Mr. Green in 1 instance, Mr. Talkey 1 instance, Mr. Colby of Arizona 1 instance, and Mr. McCandless 1 instance.
Without objection, the various requests are granted, including the request of the gentleman from Pennsylvania. Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Seiberling.
I ask unanimous consent that today, following legislative business and any special orders heretofore entered into, the following members may be permitted to address the House, revise and extend their remarks, and include therein extraneous material. Mr. Glickman for 5 minutes, Mr. Donnelly for 5 minutes, Mr. Annunzio for 5 minutes, Mr. Lehman of California for 5 minutes, and Mrs. Byron on May 13th for 60 minutes.
Objection, the requests are granted.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the following members may be permitted to extend their remarks and to include extraneous material in that section of the record entitled Extensions of Remarks. Mr. Coleman of Texas, Mr. Yatran, 2, Mr. Dorgan, Mr. Kildee, Mr. Rangel, 2, Mr. Talon, Mr. Smith of Florida, Mr. Lowry, Mr. Edwards of California, Mr. Walgren, Mr. Fassell, Mr. Leland, Mr. Feehan, Mr. Rowland, Mr. Torres, and Mr. Worth.
Without objection, the sundry requests are granted. Gentleman from New York.
In a special order, Mr. Speaker.
Under previous order of the House, the following members are recognized for 5 minutes each. Mrs. Bentley of Maryland, Mr. Glickman of Kansas, Mr. Livingston of Louisiana, Mr. Donnelly of Massachusetts, Mr. B. Ritter of Nebraska, Mr. Annunzio of Illinois, Mr. Lehman of California. Previous order of the House, the following members are recognized for Mr. Colby of Arizona for 60 minutes. Gentleman's recognized.
Ask unanimous consent that members may
Without objection, so ordered.
advise and extend their remarks. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased today to have this opportunity to talk for a few moments about the subject of Older Americans Month and discuss issues that our senior citizens in this country are facing. Senior Americans comprise the fastest growing population segment in this country. In the year 1984, 1 in 5 Americans was at least 55 years old and 1 in 9 was over the age of 65. This translates into almost 50 million Americans age 55 or older and 28 million who are over the age of 65. According to our Census Bureau, the projected growth in the older population will raise the median age of the U.S. population from 31 today to 36 by the year 2000 and to the age of 42 by the year 2050, a dramatic change and aging of our population. If current fertility and immigration levels remain stable, the only age groups to experience significant growth in the next century will be those who are over the age of 55. In my state of Arizona alone,